Thank you so much for joining another episode of Celeste, the Therapist podcast. My name is Celeste, a therapist from Boston. I'm going to have my guest introduce himself to you all.
Thank you for having me, Celeste. My name is Dr. Roger McFillin. I'm a clinical psychologist and executive director at the Center for Integrated Behavioral Health in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And I am also the host of the podcast Radically Genuine.
Yes, and the way I found Dr. McFillin is I started following him on Twitter, and then I started listening to his podcast, which I love. So first, before I get into like what you're doing now in regards to kind of educating the community and the public, I would love to know your journey into becoming a clinical psychologist. Most people in the mental health field tend to say that they didn't, they growing up, they didn't know this was going to be their direction. I'm curious about your journey.
And that's certainly true with me. It wasn't necessarily a path that I intended to follow. A number of things, like I think a lot of people, things fall in place in your life, and then you become impassioned and inspired and you start taking the next steps. Originally, I always wanted to be a helper. I knew that. I knew that aspect. I wanted to be involved in people's lives. But at the time when I graduated undergrad, I thought I was going to be in education. I was a college football player. I was going to be a coach and a teacher. That was an aspect of my life that I was very passionate about and loved. However, immediately following graduation, I actually took a job at a children's psychiatric hospital. So, for those who've ever worked in psychiatric hospitals, it's generally you're working short term with people in crisis. So, they're often going through extremely difficult times. They may be suicidal or going through some form of a mental illness episode. But I was working with young kids. So, I stepped into this hospital program for kids ages 5 to 10. And if you imagine kids between the ages of 5 to 10 who would be admitted into a psychiatric facility, they often came from very adverse conditions. So, abusive homes, many of them experiencing post trauma type symptoms. Uh, some of them were abandoned by their parents. It was a very challenging situation. So, they would enter into a psychiatric hospital because they were really in crisis in their lives. Maybe they were really aggressive, had a hard time in school, or actually were talking about suicide even at that young age. And you knew it right away when they came onto the unit that they were traumatized, because there was a strong distrust, and all the signs and symptoms of self-protection were there. It was really my first exposure to what is the mental health system. And this is in the late 90s. I think it was 1998, 99 when I first started in this unit. And there were a couple things that really stood out to me, that I learned about just the psychiatric field and the helping field in general. And if you look back at where we are in 1998, it was almost at the height of this idea that mental health or mental illness is a brain related condition. And psychiatry was experimenting with so many different psychiatric drugs. I think in the late 80s into the early 90s, Prozac came to market. And in the United States, there was direct to consumer marketing. So everything changed in the United States in the way that we viewed our own emotional health through the use of psychiatric drugs and trying to communicate to the general public that there is a brain disorder, or what is widely known as a chemical imbalance. So this, if you're feeling depressed or you're struggling, you may have this chemical abnormality, and we can treat it like we treat insulin for diabetes. So I was young in my early 20s, and the psychiatrist on the unit would conduct psychiatric evaluations, which lasted all about 1 to 2 minutes, which would ask a kid what their name was and why they're in the hospital. They would walk away. There would be a psychiatric evaluation typed up with a diagnosis, and then a regimen of drugs. And I thought, wow, that doesn't sound very scientific. And then you would see the results of drugging children. So they might come in and certainly be agitated or hostile or had a difficult time with their behavior, but it always made sense to me given the environment that they were coming from. And you would see these kids become sedated at best. Some of them would sleep 16 hours a day. Others would have very horrible side effects and reactions like tardive dyskinesia or akathisia. And it was just absolutely heartbreaking for me to witness that. And so, as just a young man who was naive, I asked a lot of questions. I also found out that I had a talent. I had a talent in my ability to kind of connect with kids. And there was behavioral modification techniques that were used on the unit. And it was the use of a timeout room and the consequences and everything you would know about behaviorism. But what would happen on a psychiatric unit is if a kid became aggressive, they taught you to put them in holds. So people who might be familiar working in psychiatric hospitals, that you would hold a kid until they would calm down, which was completely uncomfortable for me, given where I believed many of these kids were coming from, abusive environments. So I was, you know, 22 years old, just got done playing college football, in shape. I wasn't putting my hand on a six-year old or a 7-year old. So I would let them kick me or punch me. And I would just say things like, I'm not going to hurt you, not going to hurt you. Calm down and we can talk. And then they would calm down and they'd sit next to me and we'd talk through what just happened. And I just really was able to develop this ability to have, for the lack of better word, some control on the unit, because I had the kids' respect and they felt safe around me. And so I got promoted quickly in this environment, and then gave these titles, like I think the name was a senior counselor, so I could attend treatment team meetings. And within that process, I would see the hierarchy that existed: the psychiatrist, and then the social workers underneath the psychiatrist, and then me was the counselor. And I was always questioning things. I'm like, what is this drug supposed to do? It looks like they're getting worse. How did you come across this diagnosis? And I really automatically began to smell bullshit. I just realized that this is mass experimentation, completely unscientific, and you're just choosing different drugs to try to sedate a young kid. And so that was my first step into, all right, I need to learn more. I need to move forward in my career. I ended up getting a master's degree, and worked in various settings, from school settings to the juvenile justice programs as a juvenile probation officer. After a master's degree, I was doing some in-home therapy and counseling, and decided to go get my doctorate degree in clinical psychology. And within all those years, if you can think, between 1998 till 2008, when I graduated from my doctoral program, it was like this height of an era of psychiatric drugs should be a frontline treatment, and they were being widely prescribed to more and more people. So it was part of my training as a psychologist. And I had to resolve the conflict that I had with my early experience with it, and then the fact that these drugs were being widely applied to clinics and other areas where I was doing my training, and people weren't getting better. Uh, they were experiencing side effects. We weren't observing any measurable change in quality of life. The entire process of the evaluation and the application of a DSM diagnosis just seems so pseudoscientific. And so I knew at that particular time that I had to be independent in my career as a psychologist. And it's been a process, Celeste, over 20 years of then dedicating myself to going into the literature, reading all the research papers, being exposed to people around the world who have different ideas about what would be quality mental health care, and really, unfortunately, seeing decades and decades of conflicts of interest, financial conflicts of interest, and poor clinical trials and fraud in the clinical trials and lawsuits. And it's been a path for me in being able to feel confident enough where I can discuss with some articulation and some facts about these drugs and the DSM and how we go about approaching mental health care in the United States. Here we are in 2023, and being able to understand all the cultural factors that are also influencing it, often around financial conflicts of interest. And I decided to speak out a couple of years ago. So I got to do something about this. Not only do I have to educate my staff here, because I started a clinical practice, the Center for Integrated Behavioral Health. We had to develop some position statements to be able to better inform our clients based on what is best available evidence. And I decided I had to speak out, and I started the Radically Genuine podcast and a Twitter account that has, consistently grown to the point where the message is getting out there. And I think you come across people who've been harmed by the system, and
Yeah.
hopefully with with my podcast and my work, I can help people become more informed.
Wow, I appreciate you sharing that. We have similar paths. My first year in community college, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I started at a homeless shelter. And then I realized like I was good with talking to people. And so I said, I'm going to go into psychology. One of the things, with the pharmaceutical companies, it's interesting because when I was working at a company, where it was DMH clients that were Department of Mental Health eligible. Uh, I remember I had my bachelor's at the time. I was a case manager, but we would have, and it's, I didn't real the 90. You just schooled me on the whole 98 era, because this was probably about 2002. And the pharmacy and I it's like baffling that I'm thinking about it. They would come with these great lunches. Like I would really be excited when they would come, because they would meet with the psychiatrist. We would have really good food, and you know known beholds to me, they were in there chatting it up about the medicine, and what Dr. McFillin is talking about. um a lot of companies, pharmaceutical companies, were able to get their in with drug reps coming to the hospitals, coming to the clinics. And I mentioned the DMH because these are people that are, I fell in love with people with major mental health diagnoses, because when I was working at the shelter, I realized people had a story. And even now, when I work with people, I never diagnose them. I always put adjustment for insurance purposes, but never give like a name, never talk to them about a name, because when I'm meeting with people, I realize there's something that happened that nobody's talking about. Can you explain that part of the reality for people? Because I have a hard time with labels, and I feel that when people have been given a label, they feel like this is just it. This is an issue with me, but nobody's talking about how the trauma plays a role in their current struggles that they're having now.
I don't think people realize how these diagnoses are kind of manufactured. So, for example, you cannot get a drug approved for a setback in life. You can't get a drug approved for poverty. You can't get a drug approved if you've been exposed to violence, or you are a single mother and you're struggling to make ends meet, or you were abused when you were younger. You get a drug approved for a medical condition. So, in order for a label to be developed, it has to be medicalized. And the way that physicians diagnose is through symptoms and trying to understand some form of etiology. And there's often symptom checklists. So, the Western medical system is very well known for diagnoses after diagnoses after diagnoses. They're labels, they're constructs. And psychiatry, in alliance with the pharmaceutical industry, tried to more medicalize the human experience, as complex as it is to be a human being, and all the major uh, factors and variables that could lead to somebody struggling. It really became this very oversimplified checklist. And if you meet these check marks, these checklists, you can receive a diagnosis. And that diagnosis can then be reimbursed through insurance. And maybe we can develop treatments for that. But the problem, there's like over 300 diagnoses in the DSM. It never started that way. The original DSM was just trying to categorize mental illness and what was being seen in the psychiatric community. But like a lot of things, it became hijacked through money, and it continues to evolve and develop. And there's not a whole lot of science behind it. So the idea that like one person would have major depressive disorder and it looks similar across all people, and we have a way of evaluating it, testing it, and identifying it as a discrete illness is nothing but a manufactured condition to be sold to the public. That doesn't deny that people get depressed. It just looks so different and its experience is so different than the checklist. So we've we've medicalized a lot of these conditions that can be trauma related, life circumstances related, that even if you look back into history books, have been part of the human experience. But the way in which we've managed these conditions have been through support, or spirituality, faith, religion, health, a number of factors. Um, and the way you spoke about it was different. So the way you think about your challenges in your life and the way your family would talk about it or your community would talk about it would actually uh, influence whether it's going to be something that's chronic or episodic. So before all this DSM and drug treatment, most mental health conditions were episodic, meaning there's a beginning and an end. It's in response to some life circumstances, and people are extremely resilient and can overcome it. But since the DSM and drug era really began to explode throughout the 1990s, what do you see? Every identifiable statistic will suggest that people are doing worse. We have more increases in suicide. We have more identification with mental illness. Impairment in functioning is certainly decreased. More people on disability. Uh, there's a thousand-fold increase in the diagnosis of clinical depression from the mid 90s to currently where we are now. Now, obviously, that just doesn't mean that more people are experiencing depression. In all likelihood, we've just broadened the categories in order to sell more drugs. And we're just so influenced.
So not only have we brought in the categories, but I think that we don't use empowering language. When it comes to the things that we struggle with, there are more distractions, right? You recently had a podcast about media and how, I mean, it was geared towards kids, but as I was listening to it, I'm like, the adults are dealing with the same exact thing that kids are dealing with when it comes to social media. What role do you think, and I, one thing I want to be clear on, and is that it's not that social media creates this, it's what we allow, right? And your co-host talked about like um educating the kids in college, and how he would notice during their spare time they're on their phones. It's not just the kids, the adults are doing it. And we don't recognize we have power to turn it off. I have a 15-minute screen limit on my social media. My phone, everything goes off at 10, where I would have to put in my code even to use the internet. Like, I'm so mindful on how much society markets things in a certain way that I curate my environment. And people's like, oh, is it that's you, it's easy for you. I'm like, no, it's like everybody has access to what I'm doing, right? Like it will be uncomfortable at first, but everybody has access. What's your thoughts on distractions and how we don't realize that part?
Yeah, you make a good point. It's not just that we've brought in the categories. There really are identifiable aspects of our culture that have worsened our mental health. Social media and the smartphone is one of them. Uh, our previous podcast, we were looking at some of the statistics and data on 2007 to now. We've seen dramatic increases in teen suicide, hospitalization, and self injury. So it's like a dramatic spike up that could not be accounted for anything else other than the fact that that was a period in time where smartphones became more widely used and teenagers were engaging in social media. So it's very toxic. We're at a point in our evolution where our attention is a commodity. So companies are doing everything they can to try to hijack our attention. And just by a click, just by time on a site, leads to monetization of that. So the longer someone can hijack our attention, the better it is for their product or their service or whatever they're selling. And so they've gotten really good at using all the tools to hijack our attention. And there are vulnerabilities for us as human beings. And one of them is we are social creatures. And so the ability to engage socially at any moment through a stimulating social media app is very engaging. But the longer you begin to live in those screens, the more toxic it becomes for your own mental health. So it's going to affect your attention, number one, because it's going to be harder for you to focus on other stimuli, like sitting in a classroom, for example, if you're a teenager or college student or young person. If you're so used to being engaged with social media or video games or other things, it's very hard to then focus on math class or something like that. But the other toxic aspects about social media is there's a disconnect. There's a social disconnect through that process. We've evolved by being in contact with each other, reading our nonverbal cues, the development of empathy. And if you take a vulnerable time like adolescence, for example, and you have social comparison and cyberbullying, and you can say things on that social media site that you would never say in person to anybody else, or if you're judging your own value through the number of likes, you can see how that's going to really affect your well being.
Yeah, and when it comes to like the teenagers, I think because I'm 40, when I grew up, I only had people in my same socioeconomic status I was able to compare myself to, or the magazines I may buy. Right, I don't even know the lifestyle of the stars that I'm watching. So a lot has happened, and for parents listening, just trying to be mindful of it. It's hard when you don't really understand why your kid may feel a certain way. They may not even understand why and what's going on. But it's a different time frame than what we grew up in and what we were exposed to. Because I hate when people say, "Oh, the kids today are soft," right? They'll make this kind of thing, and it's not about them being soft. It's they're being exposed to a lot, and I don't even think that we're aware of that.
It's really a good point. You only know what you know. So your thoughts, your experience, that becomes your reality. So when you grow up in those screens and you're consistently exposed to other people, and let's face it, Instagram or Facebook or uh, Snapchat, they often tend to be a person's highlights, right? You're not going to be posting things on social media unless you're trying to portray a certain image, and it becomes to be, it's almost like you're selling a brand through social media. It's not really who you are as a human being. It's a brand that you're trying to communicate who you are to the rest of the world. Filters are being used, and you're only going to it's going to be your highlight reel. And so if you're not really educated and aware of that process, it could lead into you really self-loathing and feeling horrible about your own life, comparing yourself negatively to other people. That's going to fuel dissatisfaction and mental health conditions, obviously.
Now, I want to ask you, because after this question, I want to kind of go into the pandemic and what role that played on kind of like increasing some things that people are experiencing. There's this book I love, Dr. Mate, Healing in a Toxic Culture. He It just came out this summer, but he talks about all of these kind of autoimmune diseases that people have and just different medical things that stem from stress. And he is a medical doctor. And as he's interviewing people for this book, um, some of the doctors who acts not to be named because they don't want to be ostracized from society have admitted to the fact that what you're saying about this pharmaceutical culture, and but they don't they gave their information, but they didn't want to be named because they didn't want people to think of them in a different way. What made you step out, um not what made you, because I understand what made you, but when it comes to that part with your counterparts, other people in the psychiatric world, why do you think they have a hard time with admitting the truth when it sounds like so many people are being harmed by the ways they were taught in school? What are your thoughts about that?
That is such a good question. I'll be honest with you. I certainly have grappled with that idea on multiple fronts, for quite a long time, right? Because there's a lot of people who feel the same way I do about the mental health industry and the prescription drug culture. And what I hear from other people is they don't feel confident enough to be able to have that conversation with other professionals and other doctors. And if you're in the system, so like right now, 80% of psychiatric drugs are prescribed in our primary care centers by non mental health specialists. So you're talking about the pediatrician, the family doctor, the nurse practitioner, the physician assistant, and they're getting their information. You talked about pharmaceutical marketing earlier. They're getting their information from pharmaceutical salespeople and continuing education units and seminars that are sponsored by the pharmaceutical companies. Additionally, the pharmaceutical companies have invested in academics. So there's academics who are on the payroll who write the textbooks. We have become a drug culture. So we are so overwhelmed in our healthcare centers that it's become very protocol driven. So they're just given information about what to do if somebody presents this certain way. So it is quite rare to find a professional who's going to put themselves out on the front lines and step out and put their job at risk, who's unless they're really independent. And the overwhelming majority of professionals are not independent. They work for somebody else. They work for the hospital system. They work for this company. They work for that. So they're not willing to put their own livelihood at risk. And then there's personality differences. So I can tell you first and foremost, from when I was that 22-year-old kid, I question authority. I was raised to question authority. For whatever reason, that's part of my personality. And I can't sleep at night if I feel like I'm doing something that could potentially hurt somebody. Other people can sleep fine at night as long as their family's taken care of. That just hasn't been me. So I'm somebody who is independent. This is my own practice. I've started everything on my own. So I'm counting on myself. So I feel like I can have a voice. I've also put the work in. Um, I just didn't, wake up one day and start sharing my opinions. I put a lot of research in so I could have an intelligent conversation with somebody who might believe otherwise. Although you find it's extremely difficult to do. I've been inviting psychiatrists who prescribe psychiatric drugs to come onto my podcast, and every time they get to the end, they turn it down. So it's very, I don't have a really strong sense of belief that a lot of these psychiatrists feel great about their field and what they're doing, but they are so limited now about what they bring to the healthcare system that I don't think they're willing to kind of step out and put their own livelihood at risk.
That makes sense. I was also a question of authority. I went to the military first when I got out of high school, and I realized I wasn't going to go far because of the whole hierarchy thing. It wasn't until I went to private practice I realized people have a hard time speaking up, and I didn't know that was a normal thing because I've always done it. And also, I'm in private practice, so it makes a lot of sense uh, why there's this kind of disconnect. I have another question before I go to the pandemic while we're on the medication. Just thinking about parents, because I work with only adults, but a lot of times, a lot of parents are talking about, they want to put the kid on med. One parent, they called DCF on her, which is the Department of Children and Families. I don't know what it's called. I don't think it's the same in every state, but and so I had to help advocate for her, right? Because like there was basically parents broke up, so there was a situational thing happening, and they wanted him on meds to probably numb him down. But she advocated, and he didn't get on meds. He's actually doing really well. And there are these, and there was this episode I see in Amsterdam, this show on NBC or ABC, where there's a child psychologist. A kid came in, he was on all these medications. I know it's just a show, but this is a thing that happens in real life. He's on all these medications, and the psychologist had to go to court to get him off because New York public school system said in order for him to be in school, he has to have him on. He said, well, I can't really do work and understand his baseline until I see what's going on, because he got into a fight. After he took him off the medications, he found out he got into a fight because his dad had recently died, and the kid said something about, you should have died with your dad, right? So instead of them looking deeper into what happened, they numbed this kid up. He has diabetes, obesity, and all of these issues. And so parents that are listening, because a lot of times when you're not taught to kind of question the system, or even thinking that, oh, they have an MD, they're a doctor, so they must know what's going on. Really, people really believe it that way. What would you say to them to help empower them around like their kids' mental wellness? Because I think now with all of the struggles, kids was home for 2 years, not social. So there's a lot of things at play where medication is being prescribed solely.
Yeah, I think we've put a lot of trust into the medical authority in American culture as the expert. And one of the things that you quickly learn when you do your investigation and you look and you talk to a lot of these physicians and these doctors, is that we've thrown that word expert out too easily. So all parents should know, and every individual who's in the healthcare system, know that you have rights. You cannot consent to a treatment without being informed. And informed consent is a legal and ethical imperative. So you have to be provided the risks, accurately what are the risks, the potential benefits, and alternative treatments. And when you look into the actual research, and even if you what the drug companies, are promoting as far as what the adverse health consequences are, they're quite dramatic, and significant. So if you're not informed that an antidepressant for a child can increase the risk of a suicide event 2 to 4 times, that it barely, if ever, outformed a placebo, if the effects of the drugs can include numbing of positive emotions, sedation, sexual dysfunction, it could be permanent, it can induce mania, psychosis, agitation, akathisia. Unless you're told about these risks and the frequency in which they are occurring, then legally you cannot consent because you haven't been informed. And that's my greatest concern, is that informed consent has become nothing more than something that you sign quickly without reading anything when you enter into the hospital centers to protect them legally. It hasn't met that legal standard and that ethical standard where you sit down and you really get to know the person in front of you, and you develop a relationship with them and you care about their well-being. The average time in a medical setting in primary care is 6 minutes. That has become our healthcare centers. It's like cattle in, rush cattle in, cattle out. You don't develop any relationship with your doctors, and it's led to a disconnect. And I just want people to know that you have a right to be able to be provided all that information. Unfortunately, I think we have to do a lot of our own individual investigation. And there's never been a time where it's easier with the internet and social media and research papers. So there used to be a time where we had to blindly
Go to the
trust the medical
library.
authority.
Oh, go to well, for us in school, go to the library to do our research.
Yeah, we don't have to do that anymore. We have the same availability of information as that primary care physician does. So we can do our own independent research and ask questions.
Yeah, and Dr. McFillin's right in regards to the different side effects. I've been in private practice since 2015, and numerous people have gotten off of medication just through the education of understanding the why, and it's hard when you have this struggle and you don't get it. A lot of people aren't aware of like how something that happened 20 years ago can affect them 20 years later, because it was like, well, it already happened. And so like if we were educating people around emotions and around, sometimes things get uncomfortable, I feel like things like we would feel more empowered and not feel like we need a pill. And in the defense of some MDs, I think that they're taught to mitigate pain as quickly as possible. Physical, like that's how the pain med stuff got started, right? With not just aspirin. It's like, oh, we need to mitigate the pain. I think that was part of it. So do you think that's pretty accurate? Is it trying to like mitigate the pain, but that you can't mitigate life circumstances as quick as possible? What are your thoughts?
You're exactly right. I think our healthcare system, which includes the psychiatry aspect of mental health, is to try to mitigate pain. So it's viewing an emotional reaction or any type of response to an event in one's life as a symptom to be decreased, which is
Right.
odd to me. It never fit from a logical common sense perspective, because if you're in emotional pain, just thinking about things from an evolutionary perspective,
Right.
obviously that pain's there to serve us. We wouldn't
Yes.
feel it unless we've evolved to feel it in this way.
Yes.
And as you know, as a therapist, the actual exposure of an experience of emotion is therapeutic. It
Yes.
it, it does promote the healing. So
Yes.
if we're talking about what's painful, or if there's a loss in our life, or we're facing a hardship, or we're anxious, the facing of The approach coping is what demonstrates people to overcome an episode and allow it to be an episode and not something that's chronic and affects somebody the rest of their life.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And what Dr. McFillin is saying, our body gives us signs, and a lot of times those signs were ignored. And now if you're numbing everything, not only will you not experience pain, but you won't experience joy. And it's hard. And whether it's a pharmaceutical medication or a drug, alcohol or food or sex or relationships, right? I feel like it goes in the same category of the numbing aspect. So it could be just as harmful. So now I want to go to the pandemic before we go, because we've all experienced the pandemic, right? And a lot has changed for people. And I think it unfortunately has become an even bigger cash cow for these companies, because a lot of people are started to experience things they haven't experienced before. I always say, like, it was probably there, but because you were forced to be still and not have the things that you utilized to distract before, it kind of showed its face a little bit stronger, the things that people experience. What are your thoughts about the pandemic and what role it played and not just the pandemic, everything that's happening in the world, right? The world is chaotic. If you don't feel anxious, feel some sort of like fear or because for me, like, I've never been on medication, but like there are moments where I feel anxious, but I acknowledge it, I name it. I do a lot of self dialogue, right? There's a lot of practices that I do to curate my environment. I always call it my medicine when I talk to my clients. I'm like, yep, my medicine is like listening to things, therapy, going to the gym, getting sun. Like a lot of these things that I'm introducing to people, they have no idea like that's part of what allows people to stay healthy. But what are your thoughts about just the pandemic and like everything that's happening in society for people and how that plays a role in some of the emotions that they may be experiencing now?
Yeah, I started the podcast, really within the aftermath of the pandemic and with real genuine concern about government bureaucrats and the medical establishment attempting to intervene for a novel virus that had a high recovery rate by shutting down our entire economy, locking kids in school, and putting on masks. Now, nobody wants anyone else to get sick, obviously, but we live as human beings where we've always had to deal with viruses and other conditions. The way that this pandemic was communicated to the American people, in my opinion, was purposely provoking fear. And it created a divide and a fear amongst each other, which I thought was very nefarious and potentially purposeful at the time. You see that throughout history, governments always seek to have more and more control over their people. And we were giving up a lot of freedoms at that time. And there was a lot of information that was being spread that just didn't have any scientific support or backing to it. One of them was the wearing of masks. A systematic review just came out that clearly demonstrates with the coronavirus that the masks did not stop the spread of coronavirus. The particles of that virus would be able to escape the cloth. Everyone would have to wear an N95 mask in order to decrease the spread of that respiratory illness. But they were telling us to wear paper cloths and all these other things, surgical masks. So none of that fit any of the scientific evidence. But when they were promoting it as if it was established science, that concerned me. A lot of these things were familiar to me in the previous approach that the pharmaceutical industry has had towards trying to create a fear and promote a medical intervention. In this case, it was the development of an mRNA vaccination that they were, in a lot of cases, mandating and forcing upon people. So we were seeing the provocation of fear by often making this condition appear much worse than what it is for most people. And what we look back now on the data for young people in particular, it was barely a cold, and the flu was more deadly for young people, but we shut them down in school. And we know the mental health consequences of doing that. for the overwhelming majority of our population, you weren't at risk for any severe consequences from COVID illness, but they communicated and provoked fear in a manner in which it would be considered much more severe than what was in actual reality. The people who were at risk, obviously, were those who had comorbid illness and were really old. And so you shut down an entire economy and you instituted controls on a large group of people for a select few. And obviously, that wasn't a very successful public health intervention, as we now know. And so we saw the mental health consequences of isolation. We saw the mental health consequences of fear provocation, increased hospitalizations, anxiety disorders. People's health really took a risk. You're locked inside. You're attending to more social media, more television. Uh, Alcohol use increased. So a lot of the things that are protective in society, community, support, faith, sports, music, all the things that are integrated into our society that are really health promoting and protective, were all limited. And so obviously what you see from that was a mental health crisis. My practice was completely overwhelmed. And then you're using interventions through Zoom, which also takes away from that human connection. So I have multiple problems with both our government's response to the pandemic, but its impact it had on our culture. You still see it today. We're a divided nation, so much where they've created an us versus them, when really there's a we, and there's a collective humanity that we're becoming detached from.
No, you're absolutely right. And the fear piece, right? That's something that people, my listeners, I want you to think about, because unfortunately, that drives a lot of like impulsive decisions or not really doing your homework around things. And it's just interesting how for years people have declined the flu shot with no issue, and then you decline the vaccine, and then instead of people looking at it, oh, well, that's their personal choice not to have it. You're right. It became this divide where you don't know about what other vaccine they had or not had. And all of a sudden, this one specific thing becomes the end all of who you are, which unfortunately is still going on today. You're absolutely right. Now, what would you say to people now, as we've kind of talked about like the pharmaceutical companies, the things that's going on? What would you say to them? You say it a lot. Follow him on Twitter, please. But what would you say to people to help take their health back, their mental health back, putting it back in their hands? What would you say to them to help empower them? Because there are things we could do right now that doesn't require money, but it requires intention. What would you say?
In a lot of ways, there's a return to some common sense. So I do believe we have to empower our families and ourselves to engage in health promoting behaviors. We can't separate our physical health from our mental health,
Can't. We
not at
can't.
all. The things that are so critical to our mental health, and we promote these here at my practice with different programs that we provide in parent education. Simple things like sun exposure. I don't think people realize how important sun exposure
Mhm.
is to our mood and to our health,
Mhm.
especially early morning sun exposure with vitamin D and being able to regulate our sleep later at night, our immunity, our mood. It's very, very critical. Obviously, exercise, it sounds simple, but all these lifestyle factors, it's amazing. We live in a toxic society, and so much of our food is processed. And if you look at the ingredients, try to see how many seed oils, industrial seed oils, are in our foods. And what industrial seed oils are associated with: chronic inflammation. That's disease, our body at disease when we're inflamed. And that has an impact on how we feel physically, which has an impact on how we think mentally, how we feel in our body, and obviously mood states. There are
Yeah.
certain nutrient deficiencies that are associated with elevated anxiety and depression. So that's the problem with the mental health field, is you're treating symptoms without understanding cause. So
Right.
one of the things, like like 50% of Americans are magnesium deficient. And when you're magnesium deficient, the result is anxiety. Your body feels that anxiety.
Yeah.
Sleep is so important. But the other thing I want to promote is just get back to some common sense about our emotions. We've become emotionally illiterate. So we experience emotions. We don't even understand them. We don't name them. We don't
You're
understand them
right.
in context. We're not using them to solve problems and to face things. Instead, we make up stuff like, well, I must have a chemical imbalance or I'm mentally ill. And then you label yourself that way. And now you're judging your entire experience. And now you
Right.
feel out of control because whenever you feel like a human and not a robot, you're going to look for something external to try to numb that, whether
Yep.
that's food or whether that's a drug or whether that's
Yep.
alcohol or
Yep.
social media. So, we've really veered off path on what is health from a physical perspective, exercise, social engagement, sun exposure, what we're putting into our body, and our just emotional literacy and coping.
Yeah, I love it. And you see I got my emotion chart here. It's always here because it's like my number one go-to. Okay, let's pause. People are like, "Oh my God, I'm so overwhelmed." Like they're freaking out. And I'm like, "Okay, what do you need?" Once people start to process this stuff, they realize it's not as bad as they think it is. Right. But when it's hard to see clear when you're always at an elevated, stressful state, which most people now are. And so it's hard to see your power, right? So I want to stress that there are no quick fixes to anything,
Mm.
right? It's going to take work. And I think that's the thing, not just with the pharmaceutical companies, but I just think with the way America markets, they market with this one quick fix, right? Anything to make you feel insecure, anything to make you buy, anything to make you depend on them. I can't tell you how many commercials is so cringy where it's like, you're having trouble sleeping? How about this drug? And then there's like a list of things that it causes that can create more pills for you instead of saying, I've never seen a commercial that said, are you having trouble sleeping? Have you gotten any sun? What are you eating? I've never heard anything like that, but nobody's going to get paid if we start talking that way. Right.
No doubt.
Tell people about your podcast and when they find it, what could they expect? And even though on Twitter, he's like rah, rah, rah on the podcast, he's very gentle.
Thank you. Well, it's interesting. So you can follow me first on Twitter at Dr. McFillin, and you only have so many characters. So I'm there to get your attention, and I'm there to get you to attend attention to these issues that I think are critically important. A lot of the things that we spoke about on here. If you follow the Radically Genuine podcast, it's my opportunity to talk more in depth and to articulate these issues and use research and science. You're going to hear my opinions. I mean, there are some things about me politically. Obviously, I really believe in freedom and the individual freedom of each individual person to make choices and live the life that they choose. So I have this libertarian bent, probably, but I hope to articulate that position in a way that can empower people to really think about their life in different ways and detach from the media messages and the consumerism that exists in American culture, because they certainly are trying to grab your attention and they're trying to sell you things at the expense of your own mental health, well-being, and life purpose. And so we're going to bring attention to that. We're going to talk all issues of mental health. I'm going to expose the psychiatric community and the widespread drugging of American people, especially children and adolescents. We'll try to also provide some practical strategies on how to deal with how difficult life is. And hopefully it's done in a radically genuine way. So it's at openness and you're just speaking from the heart. And I'll bring different guests on. I've had some great guests on who I thought really added to the conversation. And then I'll also sit with my co-hosts, one who's my brother, who was in the advertising field, and my producer Kelly, who's in education. And so you taught a psychologist, an advertising executive, and a distinguished teacher, and you just have some really good conversations about culture,
Yeah.
society, and the mental health field.
Yeah, and I will say a lot there in each episode you're going to get some nuggets to like think about differently and start working on it. It's really good. Sometimes I used to watch these shows back in the day and this person would like the phones are listening to us. People are like, "Oh, they're crazy." It's like, "No, they're not crazy. They see the reality." And sometimes I think people like me and you, people be like, "Oh my gosh, they're crazy. They don't know what they're talking about." But because it's not the norm. The things we talk about is not the norm. And radically genuine is who you are for real.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we're starting to learn that what is the norm is kind of what we've been conditioned to think or believe.
100%.
So,
Yes.
I want people who've been able to step outside the matrix a little bit and be able to observe
Yeah.
what is going on and have independent thought and conversation.
Yes.
Like what we saw
Yes.
during the pandemic, especially with social media, is everyone kind of repeats the same message over and over
Yep.
again, and you're like, wow, we're around robots.
Yes, yes. Dr. McFillin, thank you so much. This was truly amazing. I was so excited that you agreed to come on because I really love the work that you're doing.
I appreciate that. It was an honor coming on. Thank you for reaching out.
You're welcome.